Dean Martin's last words to his daughter Gail weren't words at all. They were a silent request that revealed what he'd been waiting for during 8 years of living death. At 3:30 a.m. on Christmas morning, he finally got his wish. December 24th, 1995, 11:47 p.m. Dean Martin was lying in his bed at his Beverly Hills home, struggling with each breath as emphysema slowly filled his lungs with fluid. His daughter Gail sat beside him, holding his hand and watching the rise and fall of his chest with the trained eye of someone who had been preparing for this moment for months. Gail Martin had been Dean's primary caregiver during his final decline. Unlike his other children, who lived their own lives and visited when they could, Gail had moved back into her father's house to be with him during what everyone knew would be his final Christmas. She had watched her father fade away twice. Once when Dean Paul died in 1987, and now again as his body finally prepared to follow his spirit to wherever it had been trying to go for 8 long years. The private nurse, Margaret Chen, moved quietly around the room, checking Dean's oxygen levels and adjusting his medication. Margaret had been caring for Dean for 6 months, and she had seen many people die, but Dean Martin's approach to death was unlike anything she had ever witnessed. Most patients fight it. Margaret would later tell Gail. They rage against the dying of the light. They beg for more time. They express fear or regret. Your father was welcoming death like an old friend he'd been waiting to see. At midnight, as December 25th officially began, Dean stirred slightly. His breathing had been labored for hours, but suddenly it seemed to ease. Gail leaned closer to his face. "Dad, are you awake?" Dean's eyes opened slowly. They were clearer than they had been in weeks, more focused than Gail had seen them since Dean Paul's funeral 8 years earlier. For a moment she thought perhaps he was having one of those final surges of clarity that sometimes come before death. "Gail," Dean whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm here, Dad. I'm right here." Dean turned his head slightly to look at his daughter. In his eyes, Gail saw something she hadn't seen in years. Missed taste. Not the hollow emptiness that had characterized his expression since Dean Paul's death, but actual, genuine peace. "Is it Christmas?" Dean asked. "Yes, Dad. It's Christmas morning. Just after midnight." A small smile crossed Dean's face, the first real smile Gail had seen from him in nearly a decade. "Good," Dean said softly. "That's good." Dean's hand, which had been lying limply in Gail's, suddenly gripped hers with surprising strength. He looked directly into her eyes with an intensity that startled her. "Gail, honey, I need to tell you something." "What is it, Dad?" Dean was quiet for a long moment, as if gathering the strength to say something he had been thinking about for years. "I've been waiting," he said finally. "Waiting for what?" "For Christmas. For the right time. For permission." Gail didn't understand what her father meant, but she could see that this was important to him, perhaps the most important thing he had said in years. "Permission for what, Dad?" Dean's eyes filled with tears. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of anticipation, almost of joy. "To go home," Dean whispered. "To go be with Dean Paul." The words hit Gail like a physical blow. She had known her father was dying, had been preparing herself for months, but hearing him express his readiness to leave, his eagerness even, was more painful than she had expected. "Dad, you don't need permission for anything. You've been the best father you could be. You've done everything right." Dean shook his head slowly. "No, honey. I stopped living 8 years ago. I've just been waiting for the right time to stop breathing too." Margaret, who had been listening from across the room, moved closer to the bed. She had heard final confessions before, last words that revealed lifetime's worth of secrets, but there was something different about this conversation. "I need you to understand," Dean continued, his voice growing stronger, despite his obvious physical weakness. "I haven't been alive since March 24th, 1987. That's the day I really died. This is just my body catching up." Gail was crying now, not just from sadness, but from a strange sense of relief. Her father was finally talking about what had happened to him, finally acknowledging the 8-year death he had been living. "I know, Dad. We all knew. Frank knew. Jerry knew. All of us knew that you died when Dean Paul died. Then you understand why I can't fight this anymore. Why I don't want to fight this anymore." Dean's breathing was becoming more labored again, but his eyes remained focused on Gail's face. "I have something to ask you," Dean said. "Something important." "Anything, Dad. I need you to let me go. I need you to tell me it's okay for me to stop trying to stay here." The request hung in the air between them. Gail understood that her father wasn't asking for her permission to die. People don't need permission for that. He was asking for something much deeper. He was asking her to release him from any obligation he felt to keep living for the sake of his surviving children. "Dad, you don't need to stay for us. We'll be okay. But I need to hear you say it. I need you to tell me it's okay for me to go find Dean Paul." Gail looked at her father's face, at the hope and desperation there, and she realized that for 8 years, Dean Martin had been trapped between worlds, unable to fully live because his heart had died with Dean Paul, but unable to die because he felt he owed his surviving family his continued presence. "Dad," Gail said, squeezing his hand. "It's okay. You can go. You can go be with Dean Paul. We want you to be at peace." The change in Dean's expression was immediate and profound. The tension that had been holding his face rigid for 8 years simply melted away. He looked younger suddenly, more like the father Gail remembered from before 1987. "Thank you," Dean whispered. "Thank you for letting me go home." Over the next 3 hours, Dean drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he would talk to Gail about memories from before Dean Paul's death. Happy times, family vacations, moments when the family had been whole. Other times, he seemed to be talking to people who weren't there. "Dean Paul," he would whisper. "I'm coming. I'm finally coming." At one point, around 2 a.m., Dean became quite animated, more alert than he had been in months. "Do you see him?" Dean asked Gail, looking toward the corner of the room. "See who, Dad?" "Dean Paul. He's right there. He's been waiting for me." Gail looked where her father was pointing, but she saw nothing. Margaret, who had witnessed many deathbed visions, nodded knowingly. "It's very common," Margaret whispered to Gail. "They often see loved ones who have passed, especially in the final hours." "He looks good," Dean said, still staring at the empty corner. "He's not wearing his uniform. He's wearing that blue sweater, the one he liked when he was 16. Dean smiled at whatever he was seeing. "He says he's been waiting for me, but he's not impatient. He says we have all the time in the world now." At 3:15 a.m., Dean's breathing became very shallow. Margaret checked his pulse and nodded to Gail S. This was it. Gail leaned close to her father's ear. "Dad, I love you. We all love you. Go be with Dean Paul now." Dean's eyes opened one last time. He looked at Gail with perfect clarity and said, "Tell everyone I said goodbye. Tell them I'm finally happy." At exactly 3:30 a.m. on Christmas morning, December 25, 1995, Dean Martin took his last breath. But unlike the labored breathing that had characterized his final months, this last breath was peaceful, almost like a sigh of relief. Gail would later describe the moment as the most peaceful thing she had ever witnessed. "Dad didn't die," she said. "He just let go, like he had been holding his breath for 8 years and finally allowed himself to exhale." Margaret, who had been monitoring Dean's vital signs, noted that his heart stopped exactly 60 seconds after his breathing ceased, as if his body was systematically shutting down in the most gentle way possible. But the most extraordinary thing about Dean Martin's death wasn't the medical details, it was the transformation that occurred in the room itself. Gail and Margaret both reported that at the moment of Dean's death, the atmosphere in the room changed completely. The sadness that had been hanging over that house for 8 years just lifted. Gail remembered. Suddenly the room felt light, happy almost. "Dad looked peaceful in a way I hadn't seen since I was a child." Within hours of Dean's death, Frank Sinatra arrived at the house. When he saw Dean's body, Frank broke down completely. "He looks like himself again," Frank said through his tears. "For the first time in 8 years, he looks like Dean Martin instead of a ghost." Jerry Lewis, who had rushed from Las Vegas upon hearing the news, said something that captured what everyone was feeling. "Dean didn't die today. Dean came back to life today, somewhere else." The funeral arrangements revealed how thoroughly Dean had planned for this moment. In his papers they found detailed instructions for his burial, but also something unexpected in a letter to be opened only after his death. The letter, addressed to his family, read in part, "Don't mourn for me. I stopped living 8 years ago when Dean Paul died. Today is not a death is. It's a reunion. I'm finally going home to my son. This is the happiest day I've had since March 21st, 1987. Dean had specifically requested to be buried on December 28th, 3 days after Christmas, because he wanted his death to be associated with the celebration of new life, not with sorrow. At the funeral, instead of the traditional somber affair, Dean's final wishes called for a celebration. Frank Sinatra, despite his own grief, sang "The Way You Look Tonight," not as a sad farewell, but as a joyful reunion song. The most moving moment of the service came when Jerry Lewis read Dean's final letter aloud. "I want you all to understand that dying was not something that happened to me. It was something I chose to do. For 8 years I've been living in the waiting room between life and death. Today I finally got called to go home." Dean Martin was buried next to Dean Paul, just as he had requested. His headstone, which he had designed himself, reads simply, "Dean Martin, finally home December 25th, 1995. But underneath, in smaller text, is an inscription that reveals the real story. The wait is over. Gail Martin kept her father's final request. She never spoke publicly about the details of his death until decades later, when she finally shared the story of how Dean Martin died exactly as he wanted to, quietly, peacefully, and with the permission of his family to finally stop fighting a life he no longer wanted to live. "My father taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to let them go," Gail said. "He had been asking for our permission to die for years, but none of us wanted to hear it. On Christmas morning, I finally gave him what he needed, the freedom to stop pretending he wanted to stay." Dean Martin's death was remarkable, not because it was tragic, but because it was exactly what he wanted. After 8 years of living as a ghost, he finally found the peace he had been searching for since the day Dean Paul died. His last words weren't really words at all. They were a silent request for freedom, for release, for the chance to finally go home to his son. And on Christmas morning, 1995, at 3:30 a.m., Dean Martin finally got his wish. If this story of peaceful surrender and the courage to let go moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who understands that sometimes love means giving people permission to leave. Have you ever had to let someone go when you wanted them to stay? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to check out our other videos about finding peace in life's most difficult goodbyes.